Welcome to Roughing It with Ruth, the channel where everything is a bit rough around the edges. Buying a tent can be quite intimidating because even the lower end tents are relatively expensive, and it's probably going to end up being one of the more expensive parts of your backpacking kit. Here are my tips for how to go about buying a tent in a reasonably smart fashion, which should give you the best chance of not making the wrong purchase. So there are first off three things that you need to consider. And the first and most important thing is what your budget is. Sit down and be really honest with yourself about how much you can actually afford to spend on this tent, and then only look at tents that fall within that price range. There is no point getting all misty-eyed about a tent that is 4 times your budget. Then the second thing that you should consider is how many people this tent is going to have to cater for. If it's just going to be you on your own, you can look at solo and 2-person tents. If it's for a couple, you can look at 2 and 3-person tents. And if it's for a family, you can look at 3 and 4-person tents. As well as the number of people that are going to be using the tent, it's also important to know for what purpose the tent is going to be used. Are you going to be camping in all 4 seasons? Are you going to be going up above the tree line? Are you expecting to encounter very wet or windy conditions? Are you predominantly going to be using the tent for base camping at structured campsites? So now that you have your short list of tents to look at, what you want to do is look at the individual structure of each of those tents. Ideally, you should do this by actually seeing the tent pitched, but if you're buying tents online, this might not always be possible. Just try to be as thorough in your research as you possibly can. Watch videos, look at all of the dimension diagrams, and also check on the online store's return policy, because if you get the tent and you pitch it and you discover it wasn't really what you were expecting, you do want to be able to return it. So the first thing that I look at when I'm looking at a tent structure is the floor space. Especially if you're a taller person, then this is going to be really important. You can't have a tent that is just too short for you, because it's going to be really uncomfortable no matter how many other bells and whistles the tent has. Looking at the floor space is also really important because different tents will allocate different amounts of space per person. So not all 3-person tents will be the same size. If you're a tall person, it's probably also a good idea to look at how high the tent is. You don't want to be forced to be hunched over the whole time. It would probably be nice to be able to sit up straight in at least one part of the tent. The next thing that I like to look at is the pole structure of the tent. Depending on how this is set up, it can make the tent really, really strong or not really strong at all. You can look at things such as how many times the poles intersect. The more intersections there are, the stronger the tent will generally be, as well as what materials the poles are made out of, and the way that the poles are attached to the fly sheet and the tent inner. Having a pole that runs through a material sleeve is actually a bit stronger than having a pole that clips or ties onto the fabric. Remember that you could experience very high winds when you're backpacking, and wind can actually collapse your entire tent if the pole structure is not very strong. When you're looking at the tent structure, it's also important to notice how many guy-out points there are. So how many points there are that can help you peg your tent to the ground. If you only have stakes in the 4 corners of the tent, it's not going to be a very strong situation. Something else that is also fairly important is how far down the fly sheet comes. Some tents, to save weight, will actually end the fly sheet a bit higher up. This can also help with ventilation, and if the tent is well designed, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. But if you're going to be camping in 4-season conditions or in snow, then make sure you have a tent that has a fly sheet that comes all the way down to the ground. Then the next thing that I look at is the waterproof properties of the fly sheet and the ground sheet. You can look at the denier, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's basically sort of the thread count of the material. And you can also look at the water head rating. This is really important. Some ultralight tents that might weigh very little don't actually have such great waterproof properties. And some cheaper tents can actually have really fantastic waterproof properties, but they can be made of very thick, heavy material. Ventilation is something that can be fairly difficult to evaluate by eye. But have a look at how much airflow you think the tent has. If it only has one door, is there an additional vent that air can move through? Does the fly sheet stop short of the ground to provide extra ventilation? Is there some way for hot air to escape? All of these things are important because condensation on the inside of your tent can end up making you and your gear fairly wet. Then something that I actually think is fairly important, but which I only look at this stage, is livability of the tent. Livability is actually affected by a lot of things, such as floor space, which we've already discussed, but there are a couple of features that make tents much more livable, such as number of doors and vestibules. If you're going to be sharing a tent with other people, then having more than one door can be extremely useful. Likewise, if you ever happen to experience rain when you're backpacking, you'll know that having a large vestibule is a godsend. Livability is also affected by all the little extras that get added onto tents. Things like loops to hang a lantern or extra pockets that are on the inside of the tent inner. Things like this might not seem like such a big deal, but it's a good idea to check them out because sometimes there is something that you just can't live with at all. You should also consider how heavy the tent is. For me, I actually find that this is a fairly personal thing. If you're a very big, strong person, then weight is not going to be so much of an issue for you. But if you're not a very strong person, then weight is quite an issue. And it doesn't really help to buy a tent that you just can't carry. Remember, if you're buying a 2, 3, or 4 person tent, that the weight can be split up amongst various members of your hiking group. Those are all the tips that I can think of right now for buying a tent. I hope that they helped you out. And if you have your own tips, then please leave them in the comments below. Please also subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more videos like this one.